Good afternoon. How are you all today? My name is Jonathan. That's me, up there in the big print at the bottom. I'm a senior fellow here at Brookings, the author of many books, the friend of quite a few of you. I see this is Old Home Week out there in the audience. And I'm here to launch today my 8th or 9th book, depending how you count. I call it an average of 8.5. Cross Purposes, Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy. I could not have done this book without the help and support of my Brookings colleagues, the University of Virginia, with whom this book is part of a lecture series, my editor, Bill Frucht of Yale University Press, who is here at the moment, my agent, Rafe Sigalen, or super agent, as I think of him, who is also here today, and a bunch of you out there, as well as some of you who are online. Our order of business is that I will show you some stuff for about the next 10, maybe 12, 15 minutes. And then my journalist friend and colleague, Christine Emba, will join us on stage for a chat and a conversation with all of you, ending at 2 p.m. So that's my book. And this book is something I've never done before. It's an apology for the dumbest thing I ever wrote. There it is, that's the article. By the way, the second dumbest thing I ever wrote in the Atlantic in 2015 was confidently predicting Donald Trump would never be president. This is dumber. This is an article in 2003 in which I celebrated the rise of secularization in America. I said, I believe that the rise of apatheism, this is, apathy about religion, secularization, is to be celebrated as nothing less than a major civilizational advance. Religion remains the most divisive and volatile of social forces. Apatheism is not a lapse. It is an achievement. What I did not know when I wrote those words in May of 2003 was that I was going to get that wish granted, and in a spectacular fashion. In the last 20 years, we have seen secularization in America, and specifically the collapse of Christianity, on a scale never witnessed before. Just some of the things we've seen. There's lots more where this came from. The number of adults never attending never attending religious services has almost doubled from about 45 million to over 85 million. 40 million Americans abandoning religion over the course there of only 14 years. It's called the Great De-Churching. That's more people than were brought into religion in the course of the entirety of all three of the Great Awakenings. 3 in 10 adults are now religiously affiliated. What you see here is a drop in the percentage of American adults identifying as Christian from 78% in 2007 to 63% only 14 years later. That's a percentage point drop every year, which is startling. And where are they going? It's that rising line at the bottom, no religion, the rise of the nones, the N-O-N-E-S. Now, I celebrated this in 2003 because I thought religion was perhaps a relic of the past, that it had been cruel and hypocritical and bigoted in many cases toward gay people like me and other minorities. I saw it as divisive. What I should have seen, and what sociology now shows us, is that our religious institutions, and in America that means predominantly Christianity and predominantly Protestantism, has been for 200 years the way we socialize with each other, the way we anchor ourselves to our communities, define ourselves and identities, and teach our morals and values to the next generation. Here's just a few, just one, I pulled this out of lots of slides. There's all kinds of stuff like that. This is from the Surgeon General's 2023 report on the epidemic of loneliness. And you can see what happens here over exactly the same period as the Great Dechurching. Social isolation increases, engagement with friends goes off a cliff, engagement with others drops, companionship drops. There's also numbers on mental health issues, anxiety, and so forth. Lots of things are going on there. Of course, it's not just religion. You know, you got your cell phones, and you've got the decline of faith in institutions, and all of that. But it seems clear that the decline of religion is leaving a kind of hole in American life, and one of those holes is civic. The founders gave us a system of government which was not self-supporting. They gave us a constitution, a process, liberalism, classical liberalism, but they all told us again and again that this system relied on what they call Republican virtue, and Republican virtue comes from outside the Constitution. It comes from the values-building institutions in life like family, community, civil society, and, of course, faith. Here are warnings. I won't read them aloud, but John Adams, George Washington in the Farewell Address, James Madison, and the others all told us those outside institutions need to be aligned with the values of our republic, or it will fail. Here's something else that's happened over the same period. As the major religions, as Christianity has secularized and faded, we've seen the rise of a kind of intense identity partisanship. Now, this is new. We've always had partisanship and partisan disagreement. But partisanship has become a source of identity. And one result of that is over this same period, you have seen a dramatic increase in the percentage of people defining themselves as Republican or Democratic, and worse than that, defining the other side as immoral and evil, the sorts of things we used to say about devils and demons. Here's some Pew data. You can see closed-minded, way up, both parties dishonest. And look at that last one, immoral. 2016, minorities of both parties were saying the other party was immoral. Now it's substantial majorities. Now again, a lot is going on here. I am not a monocausal person. But what this looks like to religious demographers and scholars is the substitution of partisanship for religion, or in white, conservative, evangelical, Protestant circles, the intermingling of politics with religion, such that politics has become a form of religion and religion has become politicized. Ryan Burge, our country's leading religious demographer, puts it this way: evangelicalism used to be a term that denoted a certain adherence to a specific theology and active engagement in a Protestant community. Now evangelical just means I am a conservative Republican. It's become little more than a cultural marker and has little to do with any type of religious devotion to the teachings of Jesus Christ. We see this in the tight alignment of evangelicals with the Republican Party. You can see that process here. It rises to about an 80% alignment. Here's the presidential vote, same thing. You see it's leaned Republican for many years, but starting in 2004, 80%, 80+% of evangelicals vote Republican in presidential elections. Here's the most interesting of these. This is from Ryan Burge again. People of different denominations were asked to place themselves on the left-right spectrum and also to place the two political parties on the left-right spectrum. There's a whole series of these groups. I'm just showing 6. Most of them, you see, people who are members of these denominations are putting themselves somewhere between the two parties. Mormons lean heavily Republican until 2016 or 2017, and then they separate themselves somewhat. What happened in 2016 that might have caused that? But look in the upper left here, white evangelicals. There is no gap between their politics and Republican Party politics. And part of this is because of a transactional arrangement that they have made with Republicans, and specifically Donald Trump. President Trump campaigned in 2016 promising Christianity will have power. He said the same thing many times on many occasions. He told Christian broadcasters in 2024, if I get in, you're going to be using that power at a level you've never used that before. This is a famous speech that was given by Donald Trump Jr. To Turning Point Action, and here's his view of the message of Christianity.
I've been playing t-ball for half a century, while they're playing hardball and cheating, right? We've turned the other cheek, and I understand sort of the biblical reference. I understand the mentality, but it's gotten us nothing, okay? It's gotten us nothing.
That guy who died on the cross, what a loser. What a dummy. We're not making that mistake. This is one of the most famous poll results of recent times. You've probably all seen it, but it's worth reminding ourselves. In 2011, people of different denominations were asked if an elected official who commits an immoral act in their personal life can still behave ethically and fulfill their duties in their public and professional life. In 2011, white evangelical Protestants were, of all sectors of Christians, the ones who cared the most about character in public office. In 2016, they flipped. They became the Christians who cared the least about character in politics. What happened in 2016? This is a transactional arrangement, but it also affects the nature of the church and its ministry. Here's a pretty startling example. This is from the Public Religion Research Institute American Values Survey last year. The question they ask, a question that they will tell you they never thought they would need to ask, are, do you agree that the immigrants entering the country illegally today are poisoning the blood of our country? Only one group, religious group, agrees that immigrants are poisoning the blood of the country. It's white evangelical Protestants, and it's by exactly the same margins as Christians. A lot of Christians are deeply concerned about the politicization and secularization of Christianity. The founders counted upon Christianity to play its role in supporting our republic, not because that role is liberal, democratic, Republican, but because it's Christian. They believed, rightly, as we'll see in a moment, that the values that the church taught and the values that the republic depended upon overlapped. When those things pull apart, when they part ways, go out of alignment, it becomes a lot harder to govern this country. And a lot of Christians are deeply disturbed by it. Here's Russell Moore, the editor of Christianity Today, a former top official of the Southern Baptist Convention with which he has parted ways. The frantic rage we can often display in supposedly protecting Christian values might feel like strength, but the world sees it for what it is: fear, anxiety, and lack of confidence. They can also see that it's nothing like the confident tranquility of Jesus. When asked why the next generation is abandoning Christianity at an unprecedented rate, the younger you are, the more quickly you're fleeing the church, he says, if the only choices we offer are secularization and paganization, we shouldn't be surprised that they choose one or the other. The first church of MAGA turns out to be not that attractive a proposition to those interested in spiritual growth and the message of Jesus. A light bulb went on in my head, became a major theme of the book, when I heard the journalist, podcaster, John Ward, author of a wonderful book. It's called Testimony Inside the Evangelical Movement That Failed a Generation. He's an former evangelical, recently converted to Catholicism. But he pointed out something very important, and here it is.
One of the conclusions I've come to in writing the book that I've finished recently is just that a lot of evangelical churches do a pretty good job of discipling their members in private virtue or private character within the family. Yes, there have been scandals and leadership scandals and abuse scandals, but I think broadly, evangelicals are virtuous people in their homes and in their local communities, but they have not been discipled in how to exercise public character.
So Christianity is meant to be a unified garment that governs all spheres of life. But a gap has opened up between the way Christians are developing virtue and character in their private, personal church lives, family lives, community lives, and in public life. That's the realm of social media and politics. Here's how David French, also evangelical, put it.
The fruit of the Spirit are not just tactics to be deployed to win people over. They're the markers of who we are, okay? And then the last thing I'll say is you cannot go into the political world and say, you know I'm a bit of an asshole on Twitter, but you should see me in the soup kitchen. and that's just not the way it works. You can't cabin off parts of your life.
So there's a big hole where civic theology should be. Civic theology asks itself the question, how would Jesus want Christians to behave in American public, political, and social life? And it turns out there's an answer to that. And it's in the Bible. It turns out, I think this is what I advertise as, I think, a contribution that this book makes. It turns out that what Christians say are the three essential pillars of Jesus' teaching map very well onto essential pillars of James Madison's teaching. The first is don't be afraid, the most frequently repeated injunction in the Christian Bible, scholars say. That maps on to share power. It's not the end of the world if the other side wins. You don't try to steal the election, you don't delegitimize them. You wait for your turn in office, and maybe you learn and improve over that interval. Second, imitate Jesus. Be like Jesus. Jesus' ministry is about the fundamental dignity and equality of all people. You never treat people as means to an end, but always as ends in themselves. Well, that's liberal thinking and ethicists from Kant to John Rawls, and it's the core of the founder's message, which is even when you disagree with others, you treat them with dignity. You never treat them as a means to an end. And finally, forgive each other. That maps onto, it's not the same as, but it maps onto Republican virtues of pluralism, of toleration, and especially forbearance. Sometimes you win an election. When you do that, you are not out to crush the other side, to drink their tears, to salt their soil. No. You're going to treat them with the dignity and decency with which you want to be treated someday when they're in charge and you're not. On the right, you see the fundamental values that are necessary to run a republic, and they're right there in the Gospels. I looked around for churches that are developing a full-blown civic theology. There's a bunch of that on the book, but I want to focus on the main case study in the book because it's so surprising. It's the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Under the leadership of their current number 2, this is Dallin Oaks. He's first counselor in the first presidency of the church, a constitutional scholar, former justice of the Utah Supreme Court. But the message he's giving here is the message of the church.
Always had to work through serious political conflicts, but today too many approach that task as if their preferred outcome must entirely prevail over all others, even in our pluralistic society. Both religious and secular rule are ordained of God for the good of His children. Reconciling adverse positions through respectful negotiations is a virtue. What if the conflicting demands of civil and religious law are such that they cannot be resolved by negotiation? Such circumstances rarely exist. If they do, the experience of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints suggests that a way can be found to reconcile divine and human law through patience, negotiation, and mutual accommodation.
Patience, negotiation, and mutual accommodation, core virtues of Madisonian pluralism being taught by that church, not as a matter of convenience, but as a matter of virtue, because it's what Jesus would want them to do. And they're not only talking the talk, they're walking the walk. In two historic compromises, one in Utah in 2015 and the other in the United States Congress in 2022, this church stood up for LGBT rights, and specifically the second time for same-sex marriage, even though homosexuality is a sin in their church, and they strongly frown on same-sex marriage and do not recognize it. Yet they were party and helped push through two compromises that expanded non-discrimination and cemented my marriage to a man in federal statute as part of a package that also included important religious accommodations and exemptions, ensuring their ability as a church to continue in their own teachings. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the spirit of Madison, the spirit of our Constitution, and I think the spirit of Jesus. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is not the only group that's working on developing a Christian civic theology. Here are a few of the others. This is a space which is very, very nascent. It's just starting out, but a lot of Christians now have become aware that they have let their guard down when it comes to discipling Christians in how to behave in our republic. They are all too aware of the price that many Christians have paid by embracing a political rather than theological aspect of life. And I think that's important for our democracy. My parting message in the book is to secular people like me. Well, it's two messages. First, to Christians is that a lot depends on Christians not becoming more, as I said, secular or liberal or democratic or Republican. It just depends on Christians becoming more Christ-like. It's all there in the Gospels, all the stuff that's needed to align Christianity more closely with the founder's vision. And my plea to people like me, the secular liberals, I'm an atheist, is make more room in the public square for Christians and for people of faith. Ask in the workplace, are people comfortable? Show some curiosity. Go to a service. If you've got an inclusion or a DEI program of whatever sort, I realize they're controversial, but whatever your welcoming program is, make sure to ask, are we welcoming to people of faith here? Newsrooms should have more journalists who are comfortable with faith. We secular people all need to be more welcoming of these institutions of Christianity specifically, as I was not in 2003. Well, with thanks for your patience, I'll invite to the stage Christine Emba. I am so lucky to have her here to lead us through the conversation for the rest of our time. Christine is, until very recently, a staff writer at The Atlantic. I am sort of halfway authorized to announce that she will start very soon as a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. So she's the author of Rethinking Sex, a Provocation in 2022, and she is a practicing Catholic.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you everyone for coming. We only have a little bit of time and we want to get to your questions, so we're gonna run through this, but there's so much to talk about.
Yeah,
here.
and I went over, I apologize.
Not at all. I think everybody was listening enwrapped, actually. But I'll tack back to one of your first slides, one of my favorites, which was the one with the big stamp on it, the stupidest thing that you ever said. In the book, for those of you who haven't read it, you reference that you realize that this was a stupid thing in your writing to a friend, Mark McIntosh, and you actually open and close the book with letters to him. Can you tell us a little bit about the personal story? How did you find yourself on this subject generally?
I grew up with a very bad attitude toward Christianity. I didn't know it at the time, but I was gay, but I knew that I had some very strange attractions, and I couldn't believe in God, and I'm Jewish. Those last two things can go together if you're not too noisy about it. And I thought that Christianity was cruel and bigoted and hypocritical, and I had a lot of reasons to think that, and unfortunately, all too often, I still do. In college, my freshman year roommate was Mark McIntosh, and he was a Christ-like Christian. Now, he had a sense of humor, he got angry and irritated, of course, but he infused every aspect of his life with the question of what is it like to be Christ-like. And he was the first person who alerted me to maybe there's something here after all. Now, as you can see, I was still pretty dumb about it for many years thereafter, but Mark initiated a long, slow process of discovery, which includes some of the people in this room today, in which I got to know Christians and became aware that there are deep reservoirs of wisdom in the teaching of Jesus. And this book comes from knowing them, from knowing Mark. The book is co-dedicated to Mark and Pastor Tim Keller, one of the great pastors of our day. Unfortunately, we lost both of them in just recent years. But they, more than anyone, helped bring me to an understanding of what it is that's precious in Jesus' teaching that our whole society needs to hear more of.
That's beautiful. I'm interested in that in part because it seems like you were able to have really frank discussions and debates about faith and meaning with Mark. And that seems less and less common, especially in the public square. I mean, you talk about in the book how liberalism as a concept has, a metaphysical dependence on religion. If politics kind of focuses on the immanent frame, the here and now, religion can give us a long view and focuses on transcendence. But these days it seems a bit unfashionable to talk about transcendence in public, to talk about religion in public. And that's probably contributing to the changes that you point out. Why do you think that is? How do we get back from that?
Well, I think the question you're asking is about secularization and about why the public conversation has moved away from transcendence and talking in a comfortable way about the values of faith. Is that directionally right?
Yeah, I mean, just in your last statement, you said that you advised that we should make room in the public square for Christianity, but where did that room go?
So that could be a long discussion, which we don't have time for. But there's a school of thought on this called post-liberals, and they blame me for this. They say it's the secular liberals who have basically driven Christianity from the public square, and that liberalism, small L liberalism, is a kind of juggernaut, destructive. It's like an acid that eats through anything you put it in. It destroys faith, family, tradition, patriotism, and no wonder Christianity is in the bad way it is. How could it not be in a hostile climate like ours? So they say this loss of transcendence is my fault, and I'm willing to say, as my late colleague Charlie Schultz used to say of the supply side movement, there's nothing wrong with their view that wouldn't be fixed by dividing it by 10. There is certainly a nugget of truth in this. It is hard to be a Christian or any other transcendent faith in a consumeristic and individualistic and very rowdy culture like we have today. But I don't think that's really it. A big part of the burden of my book is that if Christians want to know why people are leaving Christianity in droves, they should start by looking in the mirror. And that what happens when a religion secularizes and politicizes, when it ceases to be countercultural and instead adopts the values of the surrounding culture, for example, by signing up to the culture wars, by taking the stuff that you hear on cable news, bringing that to church and say, why aren't we preaching to save our country from those bad people on the other side? When it becomes tightly aligned in a transactional basis with the Republican Party, that's not transcendent. And it becomes awkward for secular people to carry on a conversation, to even understand the transcendent message of the Gospels, if Christians are not telling us about the transcendent message of the Gospels, and if they're instead sounding like Donald Trump Jr.
Fair enough. I mean, that kind of segues to my next question. In the book, I think, for those who haven't read it yet, you talk about kind of three versions of Christianity: thick, thin, and sharp. Can you explain that really quickly, and then I'll have a follow-up for you?
Yeah, well, it's a super short book, and it's got 3 chapters. First is about thin Christianity, and that's what happens when the church becomes so much like the surrounding culture that it really doesn't offer anything unique. And that seems to be, to a large extent, what happened to the mainline ecumenical Protestant churches in the last century, and resulted in their rapid decline in the last century. The second chapter is about sharp Christianity, and that's a different form of secularization, and it's the one we've been discussing, which is where the church becomes like a different part of the surrounding culture, not the kind of do-gooding, progressive part of the surrounding culture, but the kind of angry, fear-based, politicized, partisan part of the surrounding culture. And that's what we've seen happen to white evangelical Protestantism. And don't take my word for it. This is demographers and people like David French and Russell Moore and lots of other Christians. That's the sharp church. It becomes divisive and angry and makes it all the harder to govern a fractious country. The thick church, a good example of it is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but that is a church that succeeds in being both countercultural and providing its members with a high-value proposition where the church asks a lot of them and gives a lot in return in terms of community and values, faith, transcendence. Those are what sociologists call thick. And yet, doing that in a way that harmonizes rather than is at war with the values of the framers.
So I'm going to use our last question before we go to the audience questions to bring it back a little bit to, alas, our present moment. You describe the sharp Christianity in your book also as the church of fear. That's how you characterize it. A church that's focused on being afraid of outsiders, afraid that it's being taken over. Mm-hmm. How do you imagine current day evangelicals or evangelical identified people responding to that description that you're saying that they are afraid? Do you see anything changing under this new administration where it seems like it's very clearly telling at least this group of Christians, this group of evangelicals, that they've won, that they don't need to be afraid anymore?
I don't see it changing. I'd be very curious if you'd also answer this question after I take a whack at it. So evangelicals who are MAGA supporters will tell you that the problem with everything I've said is that their church and their country are under siege. And they say they're voting for a president, not a prophet or a priest. I think that's undermined by the enthusiasm with which they have endorsed Trump and the MAGA movement. They had alternatives in 2024. Ron DeSantis. They stayed with Trump even when he pretty much said, okay, if the states want to allow abortion, that's okay with me. That's a lot of dead babies that they're putting up with. I have not seen in the polls a sign of diminution of their sense of fear and their sense that they must have power in order to remain viable in American society. But there's a but with that. Sociologists, people who watch this closely, say that we are starting to see in younger people of your generation, but even 10 and 50 years younger, becoming more interested again in faith and Christianity. It won't be their parents' version. It won't be like the big church where everyone's taking communion on Sunday. It's going to be more customized, personalized, DIY, talking to the issues they care about. But they're showing interest. They're filtering back, not just in the US. We're hearing the same thing in the UK. And Russell Moore, who is really a guiding spirit of this book, wrote a wonderful book that you all should investigate. It's called Losing Our Religion. He says that the way this is going to work is the way Christianity has renewed itself throughout the last 2,000 years, and it has. This is not far from the first challenge of Christianity getting mixed up with power and losing its way. He says it won't be like a great schism, of the MAGA church versus the anti-MAGA church for the, apocalyptic last battle. He says it's going to be from the ground up. It's going to be new generations of parishioners, congregants, pastors who begin to filter in with a different kind of message. He says it will be church plantings. It'll be in the small groups, which are the core of evangelical groups. That's the Bible studies, for example, where so much of the socialization goes on. It'll be in the styles of worship, and it'll be those beginning to attract back some of the interest and some of the message of Christianity as preached by Jesus. So if you ask me, I don't know if that'll happen. If you ask me candidly, do I think Christianity will rise to the challenge of elevating those elements of Jesus' teaching, which our country so desperately needs right now? Right now, I don't see a sign of it, but stranger things have happened. Can I just ask you to answer your own question? What do you see here by way of the Church of Fear?
Yeah, I mean, I'm asking you this question because having read your book, I feel like you have answers that I need. But what I'm seeing just this week and the past 2 weeks, maybe in DC, and in this new administration, and the response to it is, not particularly reassuring. I mean, at first, the Church of Fear, as I understand it, this was telling evangelicals, telling Christians that, Christianity is being ruined in the United States by secular liberals, and we have to defeat them. Theoretically, now, we have a president in office who is defending the state against secular liberals and tearing all of those things down. So he's at the top, at the helm. They should feel safe. But instead of saying, okay, that's done, we've defeated them, there's just a new enemy. So now we have to defend American Christianity from immigrants who are coming into America to ruin the faith. There's always like some next fear that seems to be pulled forth to reanimate this group. I think that Church of Fear is still in effect. And I think it is alarming that you pointed out, but I think you're totally right, that the lack of reluctance, nobody seemed that sad about voting for Trump this time. There wasn't much hand-wringing. There was actually celebration. It wasn't sort of, I'm voting for Trump despite my best self, but I'm voting for Trump and I'm extremely excited to tell you about it. I think you're right there. And then as for new churches, one of the things that I've seen in my own research and reporting and writing is that there has been a flowering of interest by young people in faith, but particularly stricter faith and more orthodox versions of faith. I mean, you pointed out that I'm a convert to Catholicism. I feel like I'm seeing a lot of that suddenly, like young people joining the Orthodox Church or the Catholic Church. And part of what they talk about is that it actually seems like a real thing because it has rules and traditions and something that you have to orient your life around. It seems real and stable in a way that the thin Christianity that you describe doesn't.
Yes, and it's countercultural, right?
Yes, exactly. I think other commentators, I know Ross Douthat has kind of hinted at this in columns, that he thinks there's a Christian revival in the offing soon. I don't know if it's going to be that large, but I do see that happening.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're at time here, so we want to take a few questions from the audience, and we have some mic runners. The first hand I saw was right in the middle. Yes.
Thank you.
Tell us who you are.
I'm Brian Freidenborg. Nice to see you again. It's been a while, Christine. But thank you both for doing what you're doing. This is a very important topic, I think, and that gets to the heart of my question. Obviously,
You have an
guys,
affiliation you would share?
I have my own news organization, Real Context News. I'm also doing something else that I shouldn't get into right now, but
Then don't.
Intriguing.
because the times we're in. But anyway, obviously, if you know Christian history, you've got your St. Francis of Assisi types who are about love, forgiveness, charity, your Tolkien types who can present a literary thoughtfulness that can capture the world and transcend the sect and religion of Catholicism or Christianity. And then you've got your Cyril of Alexandria types, power for power's sake. And it does seem that evangelical Christians, the most numerous voting bloc of any white evangelical Christians, the most numerous voting bloc of any religious group in the United States, other than unaffiliated, but of actual religious people. It seems that they've embraced the power for power's sake ruthlessness of Cyril. And does that mean we can say essentially that because you can't imagine the rise of Trump without them both times. And you can't imagine the policies that are being called for. They're the most harmful to the most amount of people without their support as well. Can we just say that Christianity, as it's practiced in the United States by its largest, most enthusiastic single bloc, that is the problem? Can we admit that? And is it too controversial to say that? Am I wrong in thinking that, or is that really the where we are now? Thank you so much.
Well, the way I wouldn't say anything is the problem, because there's so many problems. But the way I put it in my book is that from a governing point of view, this is where I come in, trying to understand the crisis of governability in America and why people are so angry all the time, even though it's a very prosperous, peaceful, and safe country. Where I come in is not that there's one problem that's the problem, but that when white Protestantism, still our predominant faith tradition, gets out of alignment with the values of secular liberalism, which is our constitutional order, everything else becomes more difficult. There's just more friction all over the place. So it's not the problem, but it is a problem. I try to say, although I am, as you'll see if you read the book, I am following a lot of Christians in being tough on the decisions and I think errors that have been made by conservative white Protestants, starting actually in the 80s and 90s. I'm not all that easy on people like me either. As I said, we need to do better by our religious brethren. And this process of secularization that has defined America's relationship with Christianity did not start in the 21st century. It starts in the middle of the 20th century and takes place first among the mainline churches when they lose their anchoring in Scripture and begin wandering into politics. So it's a long-term problem, and that's a long way of saying, yeah, the Church of Fear is a big problem right now, but it's not the only problem, and I'm not exempting myself from the problem.
Thank you. Red blazer.
This is Brother Luke.
Well, I am not nearly as eloquent as the evangelist, but I appreciate you thinking it might be. Thank you for this, John, and thank you for this, Christine.
Luke is with Braver Angels.
I am no longer with Braver Angels, but I appreciate you still affiliated me there. I'm just a freelance writer now, as you know, and thank you for the guidance on that too, John. So just on behalf of, I agree with you very much on how Catholics, Christians, even conservative Muslims and Jews should be behaving in the liberal order. But just to my far more conservative co-religionists, I'm wondering what's in it for them. Why is it their job to adapt to the liberal order? Why is it their job to change the way they interact when they really do have this sense of a decline and a disrespect in a country that is as Christian as it is liberal in its history? Why is it imperative that the conservative Christians adapt and not the other way around? And I don't necessarily feel that, but I'm wondering what we should do.
It's a great question, and there are two answers to it, and I think they both have truth. The first answer is that they live in and thrive because of our liberal, democratic, pluralistic Madisonian structure, and they owe something to the country in which they live and that structure in order to preserve that structure for themselves and their children and others. There is a school of thought, I encountered this when I sent my book out to readers, which says the church owes nothing to anyone but Jesus, its teachings. It's not in the business of supporting secular democracy. And I disagree with that. I think in a country like this, responsible people and organizations do need to think about their role in society. But that's the superficial answer. The deeper answer, the real answer, and I hope the contribution of that book is that slide that said Jesus and James Madison. They should do the things that are on that slide, not for the sake of our liberal democracy, but because it's what the gospel says. It's right there in Scripture. No Christian that I've talked to has yet disagreed that those are three key pillars of Christianity. Some say, well, we'd add, what's the word? When you ask for forgiveness. Mercy, there's another word. Anyway, they'd say repentance. They say we'd add repentance, but no one disagrees that those are the big three. Just by doing that, just by focusing on those core values, they will strengthen our country. So in that sense, I'm not saying they have a duty to liberal democracy, although I think they do. I'm saying they have a duty to witness to their faith. I just want them to do that. You know, it's like what Gandhi said when asked what he thought of Western civilization. It would be a good idea. So try Christianity.
So you're saying that if they just follow their own faith, that the rest should follow. All of the other benefits would actually come as a result of Christians.
I'm saying, of course, every faith has multiple elements, and there's a dark side, of course, and people point out to me some terrible teachings on homosexuality and women and all that, and I'm saying, be that as it may, those are three core teachings of Christianity which align closely with the teachings of James Madison. Jesus is a lot closer to Madison than to MAGA, and if the church just elevates those aspects of its core teaching, which can bring more peace and calm to our society, then the church will be better off, and we at Brookings will be better off.
Jesus is closer to Madison than MAGA. I think we have a pull quote from this event. We'll take one more question, and I'm seeing a lot of enthusiasm in that back corner there. Not one more question, don't worry. There will be a few more.
Hi. I think I just want to apologize for my question in advance. My name is Ramaya Campbell. I run an intelligence organization that focuses on far-right threats to minority communities, including threats that originate from faith communities like white evangelical communities. I also am obviously African American. I was raised in a white evangelical church. My father was an ordained pastor in a white evangelical church. So just so that you get the background of what I'm about to
thank you.
Ask you. To your comment on the responsibility of, kind of secular society to make space and room for religious practice and religious people in the public sphere, I'm not sure I can point to a place in United States history where particularly the kind of evangelicalism that we are seeing today and the precursors to that kind of evangelicalism has had an interest in sharing the public sphere. In my experience and in my study, there's a strain of dominionism that comes with particularly this type of Christianity. They're not really interested in sharing power, and the kind of three types of faith that you have laid out. I have personal experience seeing people live those types of three faiths, but overall, what I have observed in my personal study and in my personal experience is they feel that they have a great commission not to be part of society, but to own it in much of a sense. And so giving them space in the public sphere when they work very, very hard to remove others from the public sphere and to bar others from the public sphere, including minority communities like the one that I am from, additional communities. We're seeing the trans community basically driven underground because of the return to power of this particular religious sect. So I guess my question is, what is your vision for the inclusion of a religious practice in the public sphere that has based itself on the exclusion of others?
And I feel what you've written about Mormons has a lot to speak to this, actually.
Yeah, so dominionism, Christian nationalism, Seven Mountains doctrine, I guess it's called. There are these strains of Christianity out there which want power, believe they're entitled to power, and don't want to make room for others. I don't believe that they speak for the main body of the church, including probably the main body of white evangelicals. And I certainly don't think that they speak in the voice of Jesus and what we know about his teaching. With my message, I don't think I can reach the true hardcore dominionists, and I don't even try. But I hope to reach those people in secular world and those people in Christian world who are willing to share the country and do more to make that happen. And I would also say, as a good Madisonian pluralist, that it is my duty to share the country and make room for others, even if that does mean making some room for some groups and sects that are not going to be tolerant of me. Now, that's a hard pill to swallow, but I think that's what our constitutional order requires. That said, one of the examples in my book that this is, I'm of course, I'm a homosexual American. I'm part of the LGBT community. The big fight of my life, my career, was for same-sex marriage. And believe me, it was a fight. And this is controversial in my world. But I think it is unwise for people on my side of things, secular people, to demand that every single baker in the country be required to bake a cake for a same-sex wedding ceremony. I think it would be wiser and more pluralistic to say not everyone has to do that. If there are alternative bakeries that are within reach, someone else can do it, let them do it. I think too many secular people have done too much substantively to reduce the space for people of faith. And my hope is, now maybe this is a crazy hope, your church background may speak to this better than my secular background, but my hope is that if we can do more outreach, if we can make people of faith feel more welcome, more part of our civil fabric, more cherished, so to speak, then maybe it will reduce the demand for the hardcore dominionism. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong about that, but that's the hope.
Well, we are moving to a next question, so I'll give you that if you're fast.
Well, thanks. Rich Cizik. I've lived my whole life in the evangelical world, worked for evangelical associations for 30 years. One of the most interesting aspects of my experience is that in conversing with pastors, I found that they recognize that what they believe in dominionism, or you want to call it Christian nationalism, they recognize that it's anti-constitutional and say, I don't care. I'm reminded of the fact that some people do change their mind. I changed my mind on these subjects. John B. Anderson also changed his mind. He introduced the very first
Could you go to a question here?
Oh, well, the
We're
question
down to
is,
7
well,
minutes.
how do you get people to change their minds? I don't really believe, you see, that
you
what
don't
you're
get,
saying.
so you don't get those people to change their mind. They're not going to change their mind. That's not.
But if it's
my
78%
audience.
of the evangelical world, as your book says, isn't it important to try to do that? I guess that's my question, because I happen to think people do change, and you can ask them to exhibit these evangelical qualities, but if you don't ask them to confront the reality
my message to the church is, I mean, I'm not a rocket scientist. I don't feel like a genius for figuring this out. My message to the church is, look, you guys, this is white Protestant, it's denominational, all of that. You guys are losing members at a head-spinning rate of speed. And that's not what success looks like in a missionary religion. That's what failure looks like. So maybe what you're doing now isn't working. Maybe it's time to think about doing something else, and maybe that something else is in the Bible. Now, it is true, that message will fail with the part of the church that just loves power. And that's a human thing. That's not a Christian thing. That's a human thing. Lots of humans have that desire for power. But Christianity, I believe this, I get this from people like Mark Laberton, formerly of Fuller Seminary, who's the president there. Christianity, historically, is at its best when it is exilic, when it is countercultural, when it is preaching against power, preaching against the culture and saying, our vision is on the next world and what we are doing to prepare ourselves for and the people around us for our next world. That's when, to put it in Donald Trump Jr.'s vocabulary, that's when the church wins. If it's impossible for the church to preach those doctrines and be an exilic faith, then yeah, maybe it's all over. I don't know, what do you think? Can we reach, is there a reachable audience out there?
To me, that's actually a rather alarming question, because I am tending a little bit towards pessimism these days for at least some segments of Christianity. I do think that the segment of the church that is interested in winning and interested in drawing power to itself is quite large. And I actually think it's probably unfair to describe that as the sector of the church, because actually, as you say, I think those are individuals who identify with the church who may not actually exhibit any of the teachings of Jesus Christ.
A lot of them don't go to church.
Right, but who say that they're evangelical and are interested in winning. And I'm not sure that I see them necessarily losing their interest in winning all of a sudden. Will they age out? Will they be, overtaken by younger people who become members of their faith and actually practice the faith over time? Maybe, but I don't feel great about it.
Yeah,
in this moment.
it's a real crisis. And the message of my book is that if Christians desire all the resources that are necessary to turn things around are right there in their teachings, but I can't make them desire to do that.
You can lead a Christian to water, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
I mean, look, I'm a homosexual,
water.
atheistic Jew. I'm the last person that they're going to listen to.
Fair enough. We have time for so many questions, but you've been waiting in the front row for a while.
You use the word wisdom.
And there's a mic coming to you really fast. And if you could just say who you are.
My name is Paul Contino. I'm a professor of great books at Pepperdine. I was for years on the board of a organization, I think it still exists, Democrats for Life. There wasn't much of a place for pro-life Democrats. But I want to get to a word you used a moment ago, wisdom. You said it might be wise to let the baker make a decision. I'll make a cake for this wedding. That's an old classical Christian virtue you hearken to. Practical wisdom, phronesis. In a particular circumstance, how do I negotiate? How do I navigate through differing points of view? Do you think there's a place, a hope that we might recover some sense of practical wisdom in our politics?
Is that a trick question?
No. It's real. It's a really hopeful one, because I love what you're saying, and I'm a Catholic like you, a lifelong Catholic. There was no place for a pro-life Democrat who didn't want necessarily Roe versus Wade, which seems to me have divided our country even more than it was divided a few years ago. It's almost like you can't even talk about the subject, but wanted to find some common ground. It's not a trick question.
We got 2 minutes left, and I want to address this in a creative way. I'm not the person to have hope or not have hope. I'm just the person. What I do hope is that I can point out some things to Christians and to non-Christians that might help us solve the problems that we have at the moment. That's all I can claim to do. But I want to poll the room on a question, if I'm able to do that. And here's what's going to happen. I am going to ask people to raise their hand and raise them high, 2 joints, not one, 2 joints, all the way up there, if you consider yourself a Christian. And then once we've looked around the room and seen what share of the group that is, I'm going to ask you to keep your hand up if you've effectively given up hope in the church, that it can change. So let's find out if there's hope in the room. Let's be candid with each other. Raise your hand if you identify as a Christian. Okay, everyone look around. That's a strong majority in this room. Two joints, everyone.
Promising.
Keep your hands up if you've given up hope that Christianity can be what it should be. If you've given up hope. So most people, 6 people have said that they don't really have hope. Okay, let's do it the positive way. You're right. Okay. Hands up again, Christians, hands up. Keep your hand up if you have hope for your faith in the future as part of America. Okay, that's virtually everyone. 5 or 6 hands went down there along the way. So most of you guys sitting here who identify as Christians have not lost hope, and I just want to help you be right.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much, John, for talking to us about your book. And I see that we have more questions, but we promised to let people out promptly.
There's some books out front. Due to a glitch, we don't necessarily have enough books, so there's also an order form with a discount code. You can order the book from Yale for 30% off. I am supposed to sneak out that side door and go to that table in front so that I can sign books for whoever. buys them.
And
I
you
have
can
to
pepper
thank
him with questions when he's there.
I have to thank Brookings and Christine and my publisher and everyone else who helped with this book, and especially all of you.